The night my mother stood at the center of my grandmother's wake and told 38 people that I had borrowed money from the family and never paid it back, I was standing 11 feet away holding a tray of canapés I had driven 3 hours to deliver because the caterer she booked had cancelled that morning and she had called me crying at 6 a.m. I had not borrowed anything. What I had done, 8 months prior, was ask a single reasonable question about a trust account bearing my name, and that question, that one quiet, documented, completely justified question, had apparently earned me this. My mother, Lorraine Mercer, was performing grief for an audience the way she always performed everything, and the currency she chose for the performance was my reputation. I was 26 years old, standing in the living room of the house I had grown up in, holding a silver tray, invisible to everyone in the room except the people currently deciding in real time whether to believe her. Most of them did. I set the tray on the buffet table. I found my coat. I drove home in the dark. That was the last night I stood in that house for 5 years. And when I walked back in, I was not holding a tray. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. My name is Rachel Mercer. I am 32 years old. I have a corner office on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Chicago, a team of 23 people who trust me with the hardest decisions of their working lives, and a savings account that took me 6 deliberate, grinding years to build from a number that would make most people laugh. I am telling you this not to impress you but because you need to understand the distance between where I started and where this story lands. And it lands somewhere my mother never imagined. She was pointing me toward the night she looked at 38 of her closest friends and family and shook her head with practiced sorrow and said, with real tears and everything, Rachel always had a problem with money. She was wrong about that. My problem was never with money. My problem was with the people who took mine and called it a family decision. Let me take you back to the beginning. Greenfield, Indiana. Population 11,200, and enough gossip to fill a city 3 times that size. The kind of town where the 4th of July parade is still organized by the Kiwanis Club, where the high school football coach has a sandwich named after him at the diner on Route 9, and where what your mother says about you at a wake on a Tuesday becomes what your mailman believes about you by Thursday. I grew up in a yellow 2-story house on Maple Court with my parents, Bernard and Lorraine Mercer, and my older brother Daniel, who was 4 years my senior and had been, from his first breath forward, the reason the household existed. I don't say that bitterly. I say it the way you state a fact about geography, as plainly as the truth that the kitchen faced east and the hallway bathroom was always cold in January. There was a grid of school portraits on the hallway wall at Maple Court, arranged chronologically going back to 1989, the year Daniel started kindergarten. His photos ran 2 full columns: gap-toothed first grader, football jersey, Letterman jacket, graduation cap, all of it framed and level and lit. Mine occupied a half column along the far right edge, smaller frames, slightly off-center, positioned the way you position something you've remembered late and don't have quite enough wall space for but feel vaguely obligated to include. I spent my entire childhood in that house believing the arrangement was about the available space. I was 23 before I understood it was about the intention. Bernard Mercer worked in commercial insurance. He had a good handshake and a quiet, settled conviction that men built things and women helped the men who did, not because he was a cruel person, but because he had been raised that way and had never encountered sufficient friction to question it. He was present at the dinner table and absent in every room that mattered. He showed up to Daniel's football games and forgot the dates of my academic presentations. He meant no harm. He caused enormous amounts of it through selective attention that had hardened, over the decades, into something that functioned exactly like indifference. Lorraine was different. Lorraine was present everywhere, at every gathering, in every conversation, at every decision-making moment in our family. The trouble was that her presence was curated with the precision of a stage manager. When Daniel graduated from Indiana University and announced he wanted to open a restaurant, Lorraine spent 6 weeks orchestrating the celebration, the deposit on the building space, the calls to the bank, the family loan applications she worked through with her own relentless, cheerful determination. The Mercer family group chat, which had been essentially silent for 2 years, erupted with fire emojis and champagne glasses for weeks. When I graduated 2 years later from Purdue with a degree in business administration and a 3.7 GPA, Lorraine made a reservation at the Italian place on Main Street, ordered the tiramisu, and spent most of dinner updating me on Daniel's liquor license renewal and how the foot traffic on his block had increased since the parking situation was resolved. I remember finishing the tiramisu anyway. It was good tiramisu. It was the only thing at that dinner I could fully taste. I started keeping notes from the year I turned 23. Not from childhood, not from the early years of understanding something was wrong without having the language for it, but from the year I began to recognize that what I was experiencing in my family was not a series of isolated oversights. It was a pattern. And patterns, I had learned in every business course I had ever taken, were worth documenting carefully. My grandmother, Cecile Mercer, was my father's mother. A retired schoolteacher from Fort Wayne who had lived carefully and saved money with a discipline that approached the religious. She wore sensible shoes. She kept an immaculate kitchen. She called me every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock without exception from the time I was 16 until the year she got sick, not Daniel, not both of us, me specifically. When I asked her once, during my freshman year of college, why she always called me and not both of us, she was quiet for a moment before she answered. Because Daniel has your mother calling, she said. You have yourself. I wrote that sentence in a notebook I still own. When I was 21 and assembling graduate school applications for programs in real estate development and business, Grandma Cecile called me on a Sunday in February and said something that changed the shape of everything that came after. I've set something aside for you, sweetheart. A separate account, just your name, handled through Mr. Artis at the firm in Fort Wayne. $91,000. It is for school, for whatever school means to you. Do not tell your mother until you need it. I asked her why not. She was quiet for longer than usual, quiet in the way she got when she was choosing words carefully. Because your mother loves you in the way that is most convenient for her, she said. And I love you in the way that is most useful to you. I did not understand the full meaning of that sentence until after she was gone. Grandma Cecile passed away in March of the year I turned 25. Pancreatic cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. She was gone before I could make the drive to Fort Wayne for a real goodbye, though I arrived for the last 20 minutes and held her hand and talked about the Sunday calls and the tiramisu and the graduate program I had already deferred twice because the application fees were $600 I did not have and my lease renewal was coming due. I do not know whether she heard me. I believe she did. 2 months after the funeral, I called the law firm in Fort Wayne. I asked to speak with Mr. Artis about the education trust account in my name established by Cecile Mercer. The receptionist asked me to hold. She came back 3 minutes later and told me that Mr. Artis had retired the previous fall and that the account I was referencing had been closed in October by a co-signer on the file. I asked who the co-signer was. She said she could only disclose that information to the account holder. I said I was the account holder. She said the account had been closed and the funds dispersed, and she was sorry she couldn't be of more assistance. I sat in the parking garage of the building where I worked and stared at the dashboard for a long time. October. My grandmother had still been alive in October. She had still been calling me on Sunday mornings in October. She had been sick, and she had been there. I drove to Greenfield the following Saturday. I did not call ahead. I found Lorraine in the kitchen unloading the dishwasher and I stood in the doorway and asked her, as levelly as I could manage, whether she knew anything about an education account my grandmother had established through Mr. Artis in Fort Wayne. The soft rhythm of stacking dishes slowed. Lorraine did not turn around. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, without looking at me. An account in my name, I said. $91,000. It was closed in October while Grandma Cecile was still alive. The funds were dispersed. The stacking stopped entirely. Lorraine set a bowl on the counter with great care and turned around. Her expression was one I recognized with the familiarity of a person who has studied a particular face for 25 years. It was not guilt. It was not apology. It was the split-second reorganization of a narrative that was heading in a direction she had not prepared for. "Your grandmother wanted that money to benefit the family," she said. Daniel's restaurant was struggling badly in its second year. He needed a capital injection or he was going to lose everything. "Your father and I made a decision." "You made a decision," I said. "About money that was in my name. That my grandmother left specifically for my education." Cecile wasn't thinking clearly by October, Rachel. She was on significant medication by then. We did what was best for everyone involved. $91,000, I said again, because I needed the number to exist out loud in that room, to sit in the air between us with every pound of its weight. Daniel received $91,000 that was left to me, and no one told me. "Daniel works very hard," Lorraine said, her voice dropping into the register she used when she considered a subject concluded. "And frankly, your grandmother had a soft spot for you that was never entirely fair to the rest of this family. That money would have sat in a fund for years while you figured out what you wanted to do with your life. Daniel needed it immediately." I did not say anything else. Not because I had nothing to say. I had a great many things to say and I could feel them stacking up in my chest like pressure. I said nothing because I understood in that moment, with a clarity that arrived quietly and settled permanently, that anything I said would be absorbed and reframed and redistributed as evidence of my instability. I had watched this happen to other words, in other arguments, for 25 years. I drove back to Indianapolis. I called the graduate admissions office at the University of Illinois Chicago. I asked whether the fall cohort application deadline had passed. It had not. I paid the $600 application fee with money I could not entirely afford to spend. I started keeping more careful notes. 4 months after that conversation was the wake. Extended family, neighbors, women from Lorraine's church, the usual gathering of people who had loved Cecile Mercer in varying degrees and were now moving through her living room with plates of cold food, performing the familiar rituals of loss. Lorraine had organized everything, as she organized everything, and the caterer had called at 6 a.m. on the morning of the service with a cancellation, which was how I came to be standing in my grandmother's living room holding a tray of canapés I had assembled in my own kitchen and driven 3 hours to deliver, because refusing had not yet become a language I was fluent in. My Aunt Phyllis caught me in the kitchen around 8 o'clock. Phyllis was my father's younger sister, a quiet woman who had moved through family gatherings for decades with a careful, uncomfortable silence, the way people move through spaces they know are wrong but do not know how to leave. She pressed my hand and said, "Your mother's been telling people something about a money situation with the family. I want you to know I think it's awful." I asked what exactly she had said. Phyllis looked uncomfortable in the particular way of someone delivering information they have been sitting with too long. "That you asked to borrow from a family account while your grandmother was sick, and then refused to repay it when Daniel needed help." I held very still. I had asked to borrow nothing. I had asked a question about an account with my name on it. I went back into the living room. Lorraine was near the center of it, napkin in hand, and I caught the end of whatever she was saying to my father's cousin Rena. Rachel always had a problem with money, even as a girl. We tried to help her, but some people simply aren't grateful no matter what you do, and there's only so much a mother can take. 38 people in that room. I know because I counted them, standing in the doorway, the way you count things when you are trying very hard to stay steady. I set the tray on the buffet table near the entrance. I retrieved my coat from the back bedroom. I said goodbye only to Phyllis, who caught me in the hallway and held my hands and whispered, "I believe you." It was the first time any Mercer had ever said those 3 words to me in that order. I remember exactly how they landed. I drove back to Indianapolis in the dark. 2 hours and 55 minutes on the flat Indiana highway with nothing on either side but fields and the occasional overpass light. The kind of drive that gives you too much space to feel things you don't have names for yet. Somewhere past the halfway point, in the gap between one exit and the next, I made myself a promise. I was done asking for explanations from people who had already written the explanation. I was done standing in rooms where my name was currency in someone else's story. I was going to build something so documented, so verifiable, so impossible to reframe that the next time someone in my family looked for me, they would find something they had not expected and could not take apart. The success was not the goal. The success, I would discover, was only the evidence. I was accepted to the UIC Real Estate Development Program in June. I moved to Chicago in August with my car packed to the headrests, $840 in savings, and 3 suitcases. I had deferred the program twice already. I did not defer it a third time. I found a room in a 5-person apartment in Logan Square, drafty windows, 1 bathroom between 5 people, a kitchen that smelled permanently of someone else's cooking, for $720 a month. I worked 22 hours a week answering phones at a property management company in the Loop to cover the difference between my financial aid and my rent. I cooked every meal. I bought clothes at the Goodwill on Milwaukee Avenue. I cut my own hair for the first year and a half because the $40 I would have spent at a salon was $40 toward next month's utilities. There was no dramatic montage. No swelling music or clean training sequence. There was an alarm clock at 5:50 every weekday morning, textbooks open on the kitchen table before the city was awake, spreadsheets on my laptop during lunch, and the particular, grinding discipline of someone who has decided that powerlessness is a temporary condition and not a permanent address. I fell asleep most nights with a case study open on my chest and woke each morning and started again from wherever I had left off. By the end of my first semester, my program advisor, Professor Elaine Marsh, a compact woman who wore her glasses on a chain and ran her seminars like cross-examinations, stopped me after a presentation and said, "You write proposals like someone who expects a hostel room." I told her that was an accurate description of my experience. She studied me for a moment. "Then this field is going to suit you," she said. "Half of it is hostel rooms. The other half is making the hostel rooms fund you anyway." It was the most useful thing anyone had said to me professionally. She became my first real mentor, not a parental substitute, not a replacement for anything, just a person who looked at my work and told me the precise truth about it, positive and difficult in equal measure. I graduated 18 months later with a 3.9 GPA and an offer from Northgate Property Group, a mid-sized development firm based in River North, at $58,000 a year. I accepted before I finished reading the email. I started as a junior analyst on a Monday in January, and by Friday of that first week I had reorganized the project tracking system without being asked, flagged a billing discrepancy in a client account that would have cost the firm $18,000, and introduced myself to every person in the office by first name. My director, Garrett Osei, a man who had built his entire reputation on quiet, exact, ironclad competence, called me into his office at the end of that week and said, "You've been here 5 days and you're operating like you've been here 5 years. Why?" I said, "Because I don't have the luxury of a learning curve." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Good. Neither do I. Let's talk about the Pilsen project." The 5 years between that conversation and the moment this story becomes what you actually came here for are a long, unglamorous, deeply satisfying period of work that I will give you the shape of without drowning in the details. Year 1, I learned everything I didn't know and was not too proud to say so. Year 2, I managed my first independent project, a mixed-use building renovation in Pilsen, $2.3 million budget, 18 months, delivered on time and $40,000 under. Year 3, I was promoted to project manager and oversaw a portfolio of 7 active properties. Year 4, I hired my first direct report and built the internal reporting process that Northgate still uses today. Year 5, which is where the story shifts into something else entirely, Garrett Osei called me into his office in January and offered me the position of Vice President of Operations. I was 31 years old. I said yes before he finished the sentence. He laughed. He said, "I expected you to negotiate." I said, "I'll negotiate at my first review. I've been waiting for this title for 18 months and I don't want to waste either of our afternoons." He laughed again. I started the role on February 1st. What happened next, how my family found out, how they tried to use me, and how I walked back into a room in Greenfield, Indiana in a way that nobody at that house on Maple Court could have scripted, that is what I need you to stay for. The year I became vice president of operations at Northgate, Daniel's second restaurant location closed. I found out from Phyllis, who had become, over the years, my one careful, deliberate thread of information back to Greenfield, enough to keep me oriented without enough to pull me back into orbit. The second location in Carmel had lasted 14 months. The flagship in Greenfield was still technically open, operating at what Phyllis described as a charitable loss, which I understood to mean that Bernard and Lorraine were supplementing it from their own retirement accounts and telling themselves it was a sound investment rather than a slow collapse that had been funded, from the beginning, with money stolen from their own daughter. Daniel, according to Phyllis, had approached my parents in March about refinancing the house on Maple Court to inject another $60,000 into the Greenfield location. Lorraine had said yes before the conversation was over. I set my phone down after that call and looked out my office window at the Chicago skyline for a long time. The $91,000 that was meant to be my future was being used to extend a failure that was now threatening to take my parents' retirement down with it. And I was 14 floors up in a corner office managing $38 million in active development projects, and not a single person in my family had ever said I'm sorry. Not once. Not in 6 years. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in May, my father called. Bernard Mercer's calls were rare. He had called me twice in 6 years, once to tell me Grandma Cecile had been diagnosed, and once on the morning of the funeral to say the service time had moved up by an hour. His voice on that May afternoon had the careful, slightly rehearsed quality of a man executing a task someone else had assigned him. "Your mother is planning a celebration for our anniversary," he said. 35th. She's reserved the private event space at the Alderton Hotel in Indianapolis. She wants the whole family there. I knew the Alderton. I knew it very well. Northgate Property Group had acquired the Alderton Hotel and its attached event wing 14 months earlier as part of a larger mixed-use development portfolio, and I had been the operational lead on the complete renovation of the event and ballroom spaces since January. The project manager on site reported directly to me. The general contractor kept my personal cell in his top contacts. My name and signature appeared on every permit filed with Indianapolis Building Services. I sat with that information for a full 30 seconds, listening to my father breathe on the other end of the line. "When is it?" I asked. "September 14th, he said. "Your mother really wants everyone there." I told him I would think about it. I was already thinking about it. What I had not told my father, what I had not told anyone in my family in 6 years, was that the Northgate renovation of the Alderton was 7 weeks from completion and I was already scheduled to be in Indianapolis for the final walkthrough inspection the week of September 12th. I would already be in the city. I would already be in that building. The only question was whether I walked in through the service entrance in my steel-toed boots or through the front doors in my charcoal blazer. I called Phyllis that evening. "Your mother has the whole Greenfield guest list coming," Phyllis said. "It's not just family. It's the women from her church, the Hendersons from next door, the Braddocks, people from First Lutheran. She's been telling everyone it's a milestone celebration and the whole family is reuniting." I asked whether Lorraine had mentioned me specifically to any of them. A pause. "She told the Hendersons last month that you were living quietly in Chicago and not really in touch with the family." Living quietly. I wrote that down. "Phyllis," I said. "I'm going to be in Indianapolis that week for work. The Alderton Hotel is a Northgate property. I have been overseeing its renovation for 8 months. Dead silence on the other end. Then, Rachel. "I know. Your mother has no idea." "No," I said. "She doesn't." Another silence. When Phyllis spoke again, her voice had shifted, quieter, steadier, the voice of someone who had spent 3 decades watching something wrong unfold from a careful distance and had finally decided which side of the room she was going to stand on. "I kept something," she said. From the trust account. When your mother went to Mr. Artis's firm in October 6 years ago, I was there. Your grandmother had asked me to witness the original account documents 2 years before she got sick. I have a copy of the original filing, Rachel. The one with your actual signature. And I have the version your mother submitted to close it. I did not speak for a moment. You have the forgery, I said. I've had it for 6 years, Phyllis said. I didn't know what to do with it. I was afraid of your mother. I think I've been afraid of the wrong thing for a very long time. I asked her to bring the documents to the party. She said she would. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. I did not call Lorraine. I did not call Daniel, or reply to the text he had sent me in April, a cheerful, entirely unself-aware message asking whether I knew anyone in Chicago's restaurant industry who might be interested in a partnership opportunity with his Greenfield location. I did not respond to the email Lorraine had sent in June, which opened with Rachel. I know things have been difficult between us, and arrived, in its second paragraph, at a request for $30,000 to help Daniel stabilize operations before the holiday season. I saved the email. I saved the text. I saved everything. Old habit from the note-keeping years. I flew into Indianapolis on September 12 and spent 2 days on site at the Alderton with the renovation team, walking every room of the completed event wing alongside the project manager, a meticulous man named Jonah who had been on site since February and knew the building the way a surgeon knows a procedure he has performed 100 times. The ballroom renovation had come in $22,000 under budget and 3 days ahead of the city inspection deadline. The floors were new. The lighting had been redesigned from scratch. The private dining room off the main ballroom, the specific room Lorraine had reserved for the anniversary party, had 12-foot ceilings, custom millwork, and a view of the garden terrace that the original layout had completely wasted and we had spent 8 months correcting. It was a beautiful room. I had helped make it beautiful. On the evening of September 13th, I walked through it alone after the team had gone for the day. I stood at the window for a long time and thought about the hallway on Maple Court, the off-center portrait frames, the tiramisu dinner, and a wake where I had stood holding a silver tray while my mother spent my reputation like pocket change. Then I turned off the light and went back to my hotel. On the morning of September 14th, I put on a charcoal gray blazer and a white silk blouse and the pearl earrings that had been my grandmother's. I pulled my hair back cleanly. I drove to the Alderton and parked in the guest lot, not the contractor entrance. The lobby was quiet. The front desk manager, a young woman named Talia who had seen me on site a dozen times during the renovation, looked up when I came through the doors. "Ms. Mercer," she said. "The event tonight is all set. Your team did incredible work in that room." "Thank you, Talia," I said. "I'll be attending as a guest this evening." A small pause. "Of course. Should we note anything for the on-site team?" I said, "They have my number if anything needs escalating." She nodded. I walked through the lobby toward the event wing without hurrying. The private dining room opened its doors at 6:30. By the time I arrived at 6:50, the room held approximately 80 guests, extended family from both sides, Greenfield neighbors, women from Lorraine's church circle, the Hendersons, the Braddocks, people whose names I knew from 100 holiday dinners and from the kind of small-town social fabric that runs entirely on other people's stories. Round tables, white linens, centerpieces Lorraine had clearly spent weeks selecting. Ambient lighting at exactly the temperature I had specified in the design approval. The room looked precisely the way I had envisioned it the afternoon I signed off on the final renovation plans. I stood in the entrance for a moment and found Phyllis immediately. She was near the back wall, watching the room, and when she saw me she crossed to me quickly and pressed a thin manila envelope into my hand without preamble. "Both versions," she said. "The original with your real signature and the filed forgery." Mr. Artis's retired assistant did a handwriting comparison before he left the firm. He documented his findings. "It's all in there." I folded the envelope and placed it inside my blazer. "Thank you," I said. "You should have had this 6 years ago," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not entirely dry. I touched her arm once. "You're giving it to me now," I said. "That counts." She nodded. Then she looked across the room. "Your mother hasn't seen you yet." I followed her gaze. Lorraine was at the center of the room in a deep burgundy dress, moving between tables with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent a lifetime ensuring that every room she entered knew it belonged to her. She was in the middle of a story, one hand on the arm of the woman from First Lutheran, and she was laughing, and her face had the open, generous quality it always had when she was the author of the occasion and the audience was cooperating. I walked in. The first person who recognized me was Mrs. Henderson. 63 years old, 27 years of shared fence line with my parents, a woman who had watched me grow up from the vantage point of a neighboring garden. She turned from the buffet table with a small plate in her hand and looked directly at me and went completely still. I smiled at her and said hello. She said my name quietly, the way you say something you've been unsure was real. Then her eyes moved slowly across my blazer, my posture, the thing she was registering and recalibrating, and then they moved to Lorraine, and back to me. And she pressed her lips together and did not move and did not speak, and I knew she was going to stand exactly where she was and watch everything that came next. Lorraine turned around 2 minutes later. I had placed myself near the window in the clean sight line from the center of the room, close enough that there would be no gradual discovery, no distance in which to arrange a response. She turned and she saw me and for 1 full second her face went blank, not surprised, not cold, but blank in the way a screen goes blank before the backup system engages. Then the social architecture reassembled itself, the way it always did, and she straightened slightly and said something brief to the woman beside her and walked toward me. She arrived with her smile in place, warm at the perimeter, controlled at the center, calibrated for an audience. "Rachel." Her arms opened slightly. "What a surprise, sweetheart. We didn't know you were coming." I did not step into the embrace. "Hi, Mom." The arms settled back. The smile held. She glanced at the nearest tables, assessing, always assessing, and kept her voice low and pleasant. "Well. You look well. It's been such a long time. I'm glad you came. It means so much to have everyone here on an occasion like this." "I'm not here as everyone," I said. "I'm here as the vice president of operations of the firm that owns this hotel." The smile held for 3 seconds. Then it changed, not in a way that would register at a distance, but in a way I had been reading for 32 years. Something behind the eyes went very still. The social mechanism missed one beat. "I'm sorry?" "Northgate Property Group acquired the Alderton 14 months ago," I said. "I have been the operational lead on the renovation of this room since January. I approved the lighting design above you. I signed off on these floors. My name is on every permit this building has filed with the city of Indianapolis since February." The room had gone quiet in the radius around us. Not the whole room, yet, but the near tables, the people within range of 2 voices that were not raised but were very clear. Mrs. Henderson had not moved. Phyllis stood near the wall. Bernard had registered the tone of the conversation from across the room and gone the color of old chalk. Daniel had put his phone face down on the bar. I reached inside my blazer and removed the manila envelope. I set it on the table between us. I did not open it. "These are the original trust account documents my grandmother filed with Mr. Artis in Fort Wayne," I said. "The original version, with my actual signature. And the version that was submitted to close the account, with the signature that is not mine." Lorraine looked at the envelope. She looked at my face. She went through the stages, the denial forming, the reframe assembling, and I watched her understand, in real time, that there was no version of this room she could manage. 80 people. The Hendersons, the Braddocks, the women from First Lutheran, the same neighbors and church friends who had been absorbing her version of me for 6 years. All of them within range of this table. All of them watching. "Rachel," she said, Just my name. The way people say a name when the sentences have run out. I let the silence sit for a full breath. Then I said the 10 words I had been carrying for 6 years. You made me leave. I made something of it. I picked up the envelope. I looked at my father, who was staring at the floor with his hands in his pockets, the way he always stood when truth arrived in a room and he did not know what to do with it. I looked at Daniel, holding his drink with both hands, looking at a point just above my left shoulder. I looked at Lorraine one final time. Then I walked out of the private dining room, through the lobby of the hotel I had spent 8 months restoring to something worth standing in, and out through the front doors into the September air. I did not slam anything. I had nothing left to slam. I had said what was true, in front of the people who needed to hear it, in the room I had built, in the blazer I had bought with the salary I had earned from nothing. That was enough. That had always been enough. I just hadn't known it yet when I was 26 years old driving home in the dark. The morning after, I woke at 6:15 in my hotel room, which is when I always wake up, and lay still in the dark for a few minutes listening to Indianapolis. Taxis on the street below. A truck reversing somewhere down the block. The familiar, indifferent sounds of a city that had no opinion about what had happened in a dining room 12 floors up the previous evening. I made coffee from the machine on the counter and sat in the armchair by the window and watched the city go pale with early light and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not triumph. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter than both of those, the specific stillness of a person who has finished carrying something heavy and set it down in the right place and is simply, for the first time in years, standing upright without the weight. Phyllis called at 8:30. She had stayed at the party until the end, and she reported what happened after I walked out with the careful, factual precision of someone who had prepared her account overnight. The room, she said, had stayed quiet for nearly a full minute after I left. Not the conversational quiet of a pause but the deeper quiet of a room collectively recalibrating. Mrs. Henderson had been the first to speak. She had looked at Lorraine directly and said, in a voice that carried to at least 3 tables, "Diane Lorraine Mercer, what did you do?" Lorraine had said something about family matters being complicated and not always what they seemed. Mrs. Henderson had set her plate down on the nearest table and said, "I sat in a pew and prayed for that girl for 6 years because of what you told us." Then she had picked up her purse and left, and her husband had followed, and 2 other couples had followed them, and the party had not recovered from that. Bernard had gone to sit alone at the end of the bar. He had not spoken to Lorraine for the remainder of the evening. Daniel had left early without saying goodbye. Lorraine had stayed until the very end, Phyllis said, working the remaining tables, talking, performing, because the only thing worse than what had happened was allowing it to be the last thing people remembered about the night. But the room had already decided. Some stories, once they break open, cannot be resealed. "What did she say about me after I left?" I asked. Phyllis was quiet for a moment. "She said you had always made everything about yourself. That you came to their anniversary party to cause a scene." I sat with that. "And what did people say to that?" "Most of them didn't say anything," Phyllis said. And that was its own answer. It was. In Greenfield, silence from people who normally agree with you is the loudest thing there is. Garrett sent me a message that Monday when I was back in Chicago. He had heard nothing about the party, he knew nothing about my family, but he had received an email from the Alderton's general manager praising the Northgate renovation team specifically and requesting that I be named as the primary contact for the hotel's ongoing facility partnerships. He forwarded it with a single line, "Whatever you did in that room, they love you for it." I read it twice and let myself smile. 3 weeks after the party, I contacted UIC's financial aid office. I wanted to establish a scholarship, not large, not symbolic, but real and recurring. I structured it as an annual award of $9,100, funded directly from my salary, designated for first-generation college students enrolled in urban planning or real estate development programs who had no expected family contribution on their financial aid applications. Not because their families could not afford to contribute. Because their families had chosen not to. The amount was not an accident. It was 1/10 of $91,000, given 10 times over, every year, for as long as I was able to give it. I named it the Cecile Mercer Scholarship for Community Development. The university published the announcement on their website in October with a brief biography of my grandmother, retired schoolteacher, Fort Wayne, Indiana, a woman who believed that education was the one thing no one could take from you once you had it. She had been wrong about that last part, technically. But I was working on making her right. Bernard called on a Wednesday evening in October. He called from his personal cell, not the house line, which told me Lorraine did not know he was calling. He was not a man who had ever been comfortable with directness, and the conversation moved in careful, halting circles before it arrived anywhere. He asked how I was. I told him honestly. He asked about the work and I told him about the Alderton and 2 other projects in the pipeline, and he listened in a way he had not listened when I was 23. Then he went quiet for a long stretch and said, "I didn't know she forged the signature, Rachel. I want you to know that. I knew about the money. I knew she moved it, and I told myself it was the right call for the family, and I didn't ask enough questions, and I've known for 6 years that I was wrong to do that." I said nothing. He continued. "I should have been your father the whole time. Not just when it was easy. I wasn't. And I don't know if that's something you can forgive or whether you should. But I wanted to say it once, plainly, without asking you for anything afterward." I sat with his words for a moment. They were imperfect words. They came 6 years late. They did not give back what had been taken or undo the 26 years that preceded them. But they were honest, and they were not followed by a request, and in the long accounting of what my family had said to me, that combination was rare enough to matter. "I heard you, Dad," I said. "That's all I can give you right now." He said that was more than he expected. We said goodbye. I did not know what would come after that phone call. I was not ready to decide. But I did not hang up with the feeling of a door sealed shut, and that was something I had not expected to feel. The Greenfield restaurant closed in November. The first location, the original one, the one that had been funded in part by $91,000 of my future and in part by a refinanced house on Maple Court. Daniel moved back in with my parents at 36 years old. Phyllis told me with the careful, non-judgmental tone she had developed for delivering news she wasn't sure how I would receive. I received it the way I received most things about my family now, with a steadiness that had taken years to build and was not the same as not feeling anything. It was not satisfaction. I want to be clear about that. There was no part of me that was glad my brother had failed or that my parents were in a difficult position at the ages they were at. What I felt was something sadder and more complicated, the recognition that Daniel had been handed everything and had still arrived at nothing, not because he was lazy or stupid, but because he had never once been allowed to fail small enough to learn from it. Every scaffold had been built before he reached for the wall. Every shortfall had been covered before it cost him anything. And so when the real difficulty arrived, the kind that no one could quietly absorb on his behalf, he had no tools for it. The golden child, I had come to understand, is not the fortunate one. The golden child is the one the family decides to keep fragile. I thought about writing to Lorraine. I thought about it for a long time, over several weeks, turning it over the way you turn over a decision that doesn't have a clean answer. In the end, I did not write. Not out of anger, not out of punishment, but because I had said what was true at the Alderton, in front of the people who needed to hear it, and I had nothing left to add. The ball was in her court. She knew where I was. She had always known where I was. If she wanted to find me the way a mother should want to find her daughter, not with a request and not with a reframe, but with the 2 words I had been waiting 6 years to hear, she knew how. The door was not locked. But I was done standing on my side of it, holding it open with both hands while she decided whether to walk through. There are things I want to say to you before I finish. Not a sermon, I promised you I would not do that, just the things I know to be true now that I did not know at 26, driving alone through flat Indiana in the dark. Leaving is not the same as losing. I know it feels that way, especially at the beginning, especially when the family narrative about you is being written and distributed and you are not in the room to contest a single sentence of it. Leaving feels like surrender because the people who benefit most from your staying will always tell you it is surrender. It is not. Sometimes leaving is the most precise, most deliberate, most courageous act available to you. I left with $840 and I built a career that owns the room they celebrated in. That is not a coincidence. That is what happens when the energy you were spending on managing other people's perceptions of you gets redirected toward building something real. The grief is also real. I want to be honest about that because the satisfying version of this story would skip it. Even now, on the ordinary Sundays when I make coffee and sit by my window in Chicago and the city is quiet the way it gets early on weekends, I sometimes feel the absence of the phone call that used to come at 9 o'clock. Grandma Cecile calling to ask how the week went and to say something true in the careful, deliberate way of a person who had spent her whole life choosing words that mattered. I would give back the title and the savings account and the corner office for a few more of those Sunday calls. I cannot have them. What I have instead is a scholarship in her name at the university that changed my life, and first-generation students I will never meet who are sitting in classrooms right now because of money that carries her name. That is not the same as having her. But it is the truest thing I could do with the loss. My name is Rachel Mercer. I am 32 years old. I have a corner office and a team I trust and a savings account that belongs entirely to me and a scholarship that carries my grandmother's name into futures she never got to see. I drive a used car. I cook most of my meals. I call Phyllis on Sundays. I am not finished, not by a long distance, and I am not certain of everything that comes next with my father or with the complicated, unresolved, human mess of the family I came from. But I am certain of this. The most expensive thing I own is not the title on my door or the number in my account. It is the knowledge that I built every single piece of this myself, from a number that should have embarrassed me and didn't, because I had already learned that embarrassment is just the word people use when they want you to be ashamed of surviving. I was not ashamed. I was not finished. And I never did need their door to stay open. I had already learned to build my own. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.